You are welcome to this quiet and unhurried session of bedtime history. This is a place where the movement of time slows down, and the stories of ancient civilizations unfold gently, without haste and without excitement. In this calm narration, we will be reflecting upon one of the oldest and most enduring societies in human history, the civilization of ancient Egypt. It will not be told as a story of kings or conquests, but rather as a slow and continuous examination of how people lived, worked, and sustained themselves along the steady flow of the Nile River. The intention here is not to entertain but to observe, quietly, patiently, and without judgment, how a civilization evolved in a rhythm that mirrored the slow and dependable pulse of its river. It is often said that Egypt was a gift of the Nile, and indeed, it may be observed that without the river, the desert would have claimed the land entirely. The Nile was not simply a river, it was a pattern of life, a structure around which everything revolved. The annual flooding brought with it fertile soil, and this fertility was the foundation upon which villages, towns, and eventually entire kingdoms were built. It was noticed that this process repeated itself each year with such reliability that time itself, for the Egyptians, became cyclical. Life began with the rise of the waters, continued with their retreat, and ended again as the land awaited the next flood. The civilization that grew along its banks reflected that same order, predictable, methodical, and deeply connected to nature. In this calm exploration, we will not speak of war or glory. Instead, attention will be given to the ordinary and the repetitive, the ways in which people grew food, built their homes, wove their linen, and offered prayers to their many gods. There will be mention of rulers, but only as they existed within the system that sustained them, not as heroes or conquerors. The pharaohs, priests, and common people will all appear, each performing their role in the quiet machinery of Egyptian life. The purpose is to see not the drama of history, but the structure of it, the gentle, almost mathematical rhythm of a society that valued balance, stability, and continuity above all else. The civilization of Egypt lasted for more than 3,000 years, from the early dynastic periods to the time when it was absorbed into other empires. This immense stretch of time may seem vast, but it is perhaps best understood not as a sequence of events but as a single, continuous existence, an enduring cycle of cultivation, worship, and preservation. Every generation inherited the same river, the same fields, and the same beliefs, and each generation passed them on to the next with very little alteration. In this sense, the history of Egypt was not one of sudden change, but of careful maintenance. It was a civilization that understood that survival depended on patience. And so, in this long and quiet journey through Egyptian history, you are invited not to listen for excitement but to listen for repetition, the calm turning of time, the measured life of a people who built their world from stone and sand, and who, through their steady labor, gave shape to one of the most remarkable civilizations ever to exist. You may relax now, as the story begins slowly, like the rise of the Nile itself. It may be quietly observed that the beginning of Egyptian civilization was inseparable from the landscape in which it arose. The land that would later be known as Egypt was shaped entirely by the Nile River. Without it, the region would have remained an arid expanse of desert, inhospitable to permanent settlement. The river, flowing steadily from the highlands of East Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, brought with it not only water but also the annual rhythm of life. It was through this rhythm that the first stable communities were formed, and it was within this environment that Egyptian society developed its distinct and enduring character. The Nile's cycle of flooding and recession was predictable, and this predictability was perhaps the single most important factor in the survival of ancient Egypt. Each year, sometime between June and September, the waters would rise, spilling over the riverbanks and covering the surrounding fields. When the floodwaters retreated, they left behind a layer of dark, fertile silt, rich in nutrients and ideal for agriculture. The people who lived along the river learned to depend on this pattern, timing their planting and harvesting according to the behavior of the river. In this way, the Egyptians developed a kind of partnership with nature, neither conquering it nor resisting it, but adapting to it with patience and regularity. The land that bordered the river was called the Black Land, named for the dark soil deposited by the floods. Beyond it stretched the Red Land, the dry, barren desert that extended into endless dunes and rocky plateaus. This natural contrast between the fertile valley and the desolate desert gave Egypt its unique geography. It was a narrow strip of life bordered by death, a thin line of green surrounded by silence. The desert served as a natural barrier against invaders, while the river acted as a corridor that linked distant communities. Thus, the geography of Egypt encouraged both security and unity. As settlements grew along the Nile, people began to build irrigation systems to manage the floodwaters more effectively. Simple channels and basins were dug to direct water to the fields during dry periods. Over time, this developed into an organized system of water management, which required cooperation among the people. It was noted that this cooperation, born from necessity, became a model for the broader organization of Egyptian society. The need to measure land and water gave rise to early forms of administration, record-keeping, and even mathematics. Each year, after the floodwaters receded, boundaries had to be re-established, and this task demanded precision and authority. From such small, practical beginnings emerged the foundation of Egyptian governance. The earliest inhabitants of the Nile Valley were farmers and herders. They grew wheat and barley, and they raised cattle, sheep, and goats. They used simple wooden tools and worked from sunrise to sunset, guided by the cycle of the seasons. It was a life of repetition and dependence on nature's patterns. Yet, it was also a life of quiet continuity, for as long as the river continued to flow, the people could expect food, shelter, and stability. Archaeological evidence suggests that by 5000 BCE, communities had begun to cluster in permanent villages along the river. Pottery, tools, and remnants of early dwellings show a society that was already learning to adapt to its environment with skill and persistence. In time, these small communities began to merge into larger units. The land of Egypt gradually divided into two regions, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. The distinction was not geographical but directional, based on the flow of the river from south to north. Upper Egypt consisted of narrow valleys and steep cliffs, while Lower Egypt included the wide delta region where the river fanned out into multiple branches before meeting the sea. Each region developed its own customs, rulers, and symbols. It is believed that the white crown represented Upper Egypt, and the red crown represented Lower Egypt. For many generations, these two lands existed side by side, separate yet interdependent, until they were eventually united under one ruler, a moment that marked the true beginning of Egyptian civilization. The environment dictated not only how the Egyptians lived but also how they thought. The regularity of the Nile's flooding, so dependable and life-giving, created in the Egyptian mind a deep respect for order and balance. This concept, later known as Ma'at, became the moral and spiritual foundation of their culture. Ma'at represented truth, harmony, and the correct order of things. Just as the river rose and fell in its appointed time, so too was life expected to follow a pattern of balance. The pharaohs would later claim that their divine duty was to maintain Ma'at throughout the land. It is not surprising that a people who lived by the rhythms of a river came to value stability more than change. The settlements that formed along the Nile were constructed with simplicity and practicality. Houses were often made from mud brick, which was produced by mixing clay from the riverbanks with straw and drying it in the sun. Roofs were flat, serving as additional living spaces where families could sleep during hot nights. Walls were thick to keep out the heat, and the interiors were sparsely furnished. Life was modest, and possessions were few. Most households had a small grinding stone for flour, a few pots for cooking, and simple tools for farming. It was observed that the people led lives of quiet routine, rising early to work in the fields, returning at midday to rest, and continuing again until dusk. The river provided not only sustenance but also a means of communication. Boats made from papyrus reeds were used to transport goods and people from one settlement to another. The gentle current of the river allowed for movement both upstream and downstream, depending on the season and the direction of the wind. Trade between regions flourished, with goods such as grain, pottery, and woven cloth being exchanged. The Nile was, in every sense, a living road, a slow-moving highway that connected the entire civilization. Animals also played an important role in daily life. Cattle were valuable for plowing fields, while donkeys carried goods across the land. Cats were domesticated to protect grain stores from rodents, and they soon became symbols of protection and grace. The presence of these animals in households suggests a society that was practical, observant, and deeply connected to the natural world. As centuries passed, the agricultural surplus created by the Nile's fertility allowed some people to pursue trades other than farming. Artisans, potters, and stoneworkers began to appear. Villages grew into towns, and towns into small city-states. These centers became hubs of administration, where scribes recorded harvests, trades, and offerings to the gods. The invention of writing, through the use of hieroglyphs, may have begun as a method of keeping agricultural records. Thus, even the art of writing can be traced back to the patient observation of the river's cycles and the need to maintain balance between people and nature. The first chapter of Egypt's history, therefore, was written not in stone but in silt, in the black soil that renewed itself each year. The people who lived along the Nile did not conquer their environment, they adjusted to it. Theirs was a civilization of endurance rather than ambition, of harmony rather than conquest. Each sunrise over the river marked the continuation of a pattern that had already endured for generations. It was a world built on repetition, where the passage of time was felt not as progress but as a return of the flood, the harvest, and the eternal flow of the Nile itself. And so, in the beginning, before the pyramids rose and before the pharaohs ruled, Egypt existed as a quiet rhythm between water and desert, between life and silence. It was a civilization born not from sudden brilliance but from the patient and steady flow of a river that never ceased to give. When the first groups of people began to settle permanently along the Nile, life became organized around the simple yet profound cycles of the land. Villages slowly appeared along the narrow strips of fertile ground. It was observed that the earliest dwellings were modest, small rectangular houses made of mud brick, constructed by hand using clay from the riverbanks mixed with straw. The roofs were flat and often used as sleeping spaces during the hot summer months. Each house was built close to another, forming clusters that eventually became villages. The arrangement of these early communities reflected both cooperation and necessity. Proximity to the river ensured water for drinking, cooking, and irrigation, while closeness to neighbors provided safety and shared labor. It is thought that early Egyptian society functioned with a quiet rhythm of work and rest. Daily life was predictable, divided by the rising and setting of the sun. At dawn, farmers would walk to their fields, carrying wooden plows and simple tools. Oxen and donkeys were used to pull plows through the moist soil left by the receding floods. Men worked in the fields, while women managed households, grinding grain, baking bread, weaving linen, and caring for children. These tasks, though repetitive, were regarded as essential to maintaining balance within the family and the community. The pace of life was slow, and the patterns rarely changed from one generation to the next. The social structure of these early settlements was simple but already beginning to show organization. At the top were local leaders, perhaps the earliest forms of chiefs or elders, who coordinated irrigation and storage. It was noted that collective effort was needed to manage the floodwaters effectively. Dikes, canals, and basins had to be constructed and maintained regularly. This required the cooperation of many people and someone to oversee it. These early systems of shared labor were the foundation upon which later Egyptian administration would be built. Food was central to daily life, and its preparation followed well-established routines. Bread was made from emmer wheat, which was coarser than modern varieties. The grain was ground on stone querns, mixed with water, and baked in clay ovens. Beer, made from barley, was brewed in large jars and consumed daily. It was not considered an indulgence but a basic part of the diet, providing both nutrition and hydration. Vegetables such as onions, leeks, and garlic were common, and fruits like dates and figs were gathered when available. Meat was eaten sparingly, often reserved for special occasions or offerings. For most people, life was sustained through the consistent repetition of these modest meals, prepared and consumed in much the same way for thousands of years. Clothing was simple and practical. The hot climate required garments that were light and breathable. Linen, woven from the flax plant, was the preferred fabric. It was observed that men wore short kilts, while women wore straight dresses tied at the shoulders. Children often wore no clothing until adolescence. Jewelry was worn by both men and women, not only for decoration but for protection. Amulets and small charms, often made of stone or faience, were believed to guard against harm. The act of dressing each morning followed a quiet, ritual-like repetition, much like every other part of life in the Nile Valley. The Nile was not only a source of sustenance but also the main route for transportation and trade. Small boats made from bundles of papyrus reeds were used to travel between villages. Larger wooden boats were later developed for carrying heavier loads. The river connected people from distant parts of Egypt, allowing the exchange of goods and ideas. Fishermen worked the waters with nets and hooks, providing an important source of protein. Along the riverbanks, pottery workshops, granaries, and storehouses gradually appeared. It was through this river network that Egypt began to take on the form of a connected and coherent society. Religion was already present in the earliest stages of settlement. The people observed the forces of nature and attributed them to divine powers. The river's flooding, the movement of the sun, and the growth of crops were all seen as acts of unseen beings. Shrines were built from mud brick, small and humble, often containing simple offerings of grain, oil, or animal figures. The earliest gods were associated with local regions or natural elements. It was believed that each town or village had its own protective deity, responsible for the well-being of its people. Over time, these local beliefs would merge into the complex religious system that later defined Egypt. It was also during this time that early burial practices began. The Egyptians believed that life continued after death, though in a form that mirrored earthly existence. Bodies were buried in shallow graves in the desert, where the dry heat naturally preserved them. Simple goods, pottery, food, and tools, were placed beside the deceased, suggesting an expectation of continued need in another world. This practice of burial, humble though it was, laid the foundation for the great tombs and pyramids that would come centuries later. Trade began modestly. Early Egyptians exchanged surplus grain or linen for goods not available locally, such as stone, copper, and incense. The materials for building and crafting were limited in the Nile Valley, so traders traveled to nearby regions, Nubia, Sinai, and the Levant. These exchanges were conducted in a practical, orderly manner, with goods transported by boat along the river or by caravan across the desert. It is thought that through these early interactions, the Egyptians developed a sense of the world beyond their narrow valley, though their own land remained the center of all activity. Art also appeared in this early period, though not in the grand form it would later take. Pottery was painted with simple geometric patterns. Small figurines were carved from bone or clay. These objects were not created for beauty alone but often had religious or symbolic meaning. The act of crafting was repetitive and meditative. Each potter's movement was deliberate, each brushstroke controlled. In this way, Egyptian art developed its characteristic calm and orderliness, qualities that would persist for millennia. The calendar, too, was an early product of careful observation. By watching the stars, particularly the rising of Sirius, the Egyptians learned to predict the coming of the flood. This knowledge allowed them to plan agricultural work more efficiently. The year was divided into 3 seasons: the season of inundation, the season of planting, and the season of harvest. Each season followed the other with predictable regularity. This sense of measured time, based on the rhythm of the river and the sky, shaped the Egyptian view of existence itself, a continuous cycle rather than a linear progression. It was noted that in these early centuries, change came slowly, almost imperceptibly. The tools, the houses, the rituals, and the language all evolved, but never abruptly. Each generation built upon the habits of the last. The landscape, unchanging in its vastness, reinforced this stability. The people of early Egypt were content to repeat what had been proven to work. Their innovations were quiet, practical, and steady, rather than bold or experimental. Thus, the early settlements of Egypt were not defined by conquest or expansion, but by endurance. Their world was confined to the fertile banks of the Nile, and yet within that narrow strip of land, they achieved a lasting harmony. The seeds of later greatness, the organization, the reverence for order, the devotion to ritual, were already present in these small villages. It may be said that Egyptian civilization was not created in a single moment of invention, but grew slowly from the patient repetition of simple acts: farming, building, worshipping, and remembering. And so, the story of Egypt continued to unfold quietly, as each sunrise over the Nile revealed a world unchanged, and yet, in its unchanging rhythm, eternally alive. It was during the long passage of centuries that the small and scattered communities of early Egypt began to unite into larger territories. This process did not happen suddenly but rather through a gradual accumulation of cooperation, trade, and shared customs. Over time, clusters of villages along the Nile began to form regional centers. These were known as nomes, each ruled by a local leader or nomarch. It was observed that the nomarchs held both administrative and religious authority, responsible for managing irrigation, collecting grain, and maintaining order. These regional divisions would become the early political structure of Egypt, long before the appearance of its famous pharaohs. The Nile's geography naturally divided the land into 2 main regions: Upper Egypt, stretching from the southern cataracts to the area near modern Cairo, and Lower Egypt, encompassing the wide delta where the river branched toward the Mediterranean. The differences between these regions were notable. Upper Egypt, narrow and bordered by cliffs, encouraged unity through necessity. Its people lived close to one another along the riverbanks. Lower Egypt, with its open plains and marshlands, was more dispersed but richer in resources. Each developed distinct traditions, dialects, and local deities. Yet both depended upon the Nile and its cycles, which bound them in shared purpose. As trade and interaction increased, competition among the nomes became more visible. It was likely that disputes over water, farmland, and trade routes led to the emergence of stronger regional rulers. These early leaders were not kings in the later sense but local authorities whose power rested on their ability to organize people and manage resources effectively. Over generations, some of these rulers began to dominate neighboring areas, absorbing smaller communities under their control. The unification of Egypt, therefore, was not the result of conquest alone but of long, slow consolidation driven by necessity and geography. Archaeological evidence from this period suggests increasing complexity in settlements. Larger towns appeared, and administrative buildings began to emerge. Hierakonpolis, in Upper Egypt, became one of the early centers of power, with impressive structures and ceremonial artifacts. It was there that the first signs of royal symbolism appeared: crowns, scepters, and ceremonial mace heads depicting leaders smiting their enemies. These images were not merely artistic, they represented the growing idea of centralized authority. The ruler was beginning to be seen as a divine figure, responsible for maintaining balance and ensuring prosperity. The process of unification is often associated with a ruler known as Narmer, or sometimes Menes. Though historical certainty is limited, it is generally accepted that Narmer was the first to unite Upper and Lower Egypt, around 3100 BCE. The evidence comes from the Narmer palette, a carved stone tablet showing the ruler wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. The imagery is symbolic, depicting the merging of two lands under one authority. Whether Narmer truly accomplished this or whether the artifact merely represents the idea of unity, it marks the beginning of what would later be known as the early dynastic period. The unification of Egypt brought significant changes. Administration became centralized, and the idea of kingship took on a sacred dimension. The pharaoh was not regarded simply as a political leader but as the embodiment of divine order, the living representative of the gods on earth. It was believed that his role was to maintain ma'at, the balance between order and chaos. This concept, rooted in the natural cycles of the Nile, became the guiding principle of Egyptian government, religion, and society. The pharaoh was the guarantor of stability, and his authority extended over all aspects of life, from the construction of temples to the regulation of grain storage. With the establishment of kingship came the development of bureaucracy. Officials, scribes, and priests formed an organized system that recorded harvests, distributed food, and managed labor. Writing, which had begun as simple accounting marks, evolved into a full system of hieroglyphs. These symbols, carved or painted with care, became the language of administration and ritual. The role of the scribe grew important, for through their careful documentation, the will of the king and the stability of the kingdom were preserved. It was noted that Egyptian scribes worked with deliberate precision, repeating the same characters for centuries with little alteration, a reflection of their society's preference for permanence over change. Religion and politics were deeply intertwined. Each pharaoh was associated with divine lineage, often linked to the falcon god Horus, symbol of kingship. Temples dedicated to Horus, Ra, and other deities became centers of both worship and administration. The early kings built simple tombs of mud brick called mastabas, which served as both burial places and symbols of authority. Within these tombs, food, tools, and small treasures were buried alongside the deceased, reflecting the belief in a continuous existence after death. The concept of eternity, so central to Egyptian thought, found expression in these early monuments. Daily life under the early kings did not change dramatically for most people. Farmers continued to cultivate the land, craftsmen continued their work, and traders sailed along the Nile as before. Yet, Gradually, the organization of society became more formal. Taxes were collected, labor was conscripted for state projects, and festivals honoring the pharaoh were observed across the land. The rhythm of daily life was now accompanied by rituals of loyalty to the divine ruler. Even the architecture of villages began to reflect this unity, with buildings aligned toward the river or toward the royal temples that dominated the landscape. It was also during this period that art and symbolism became standardized. The same proportions, poses, and hieroglyphic conventions would appear again and again in Egyptian history. The pharaoh was always shown larger than other figures, facing left or right in profile, standing or seated with calm composure. These artistic rules were not the result of creative innovation but of deliberate repetition, a reflection of Egypt's enduring desire for order. It was believed that to depict the king or the gods in any other form would disturb the balance of the world. The early dynasties of Egypt established many patterns that would persist for millennia. The connection between the ruler and the divine, the organization of labor for monumental construction, the maintenance of written records, and the cyclical understanding of time all took shape during this foundational era. The pace of change remained slow, deliberate, and consistent. Each pharaoh inherited not only the throne but also the duty of preserving the structure left by his predecessors. The role of innovation was limited, the emphasis was on continuity. In observing this long period of early kingship, one may note that Egypt's greatness was not born of sudden conquest or invention but of long, quiet discipline. The people of the Nile valued endurance above expansion, repetition above novelty, and stability above ambition. The land remained largely unchanged, the river flowed as before, and the work of life continued in its familiar cycles. The unification of Egypt was, therefore, not merely a political achievement but a philosophical one, the triumph of balance and order over chaos and disorder. Thus, as the first and second dynasties gave shape to the early kingdom, the tone of Egyptian civilization was set. A tone of patience, precision, and quiet permanence. From these early beginnings, the great kingdoms that followed would rise, not through sudden brilliance, but through the enduring repetition of form, faith, and the steady flow of the Nile. With the foundation of kingship firmly established, Egypt entered a long and steady era now known as the Old Kingdom. It was during this period, beginning around 2700 BCE, that many of the structures and customs most associated with ancient Egypt took shape. It was an age defined not by change but by perfection, in which the principles of order, balance, and continuity were expressed in stone. The kings of this time ruled from the city of Memphis, which was located near the point where Upper and Lower Egypt met. From this central position, the pharaohs administered the entire land through a network of officials, scribes, and priests. The land was organized, the harvests recorded, and the labor of thousands directed toward the service of the gods and the state. The Old Kingdom is often called the Age of the Pyramids, for it was then that the Egyptians began to build their great monuments in stone. It was not the sudden invention of architecture but rather the gradual evolution of earlier tomb forms. The first major example of stone building is found in the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara. This structure, designed by the architect Imhotep, was essentially a series of mastabas stacked upon one another, forming a step-like design. It was observed that this innovation represented more than architectural progress. It marked a shift in how Egyptians understood death and eternity. The pharaoh's tomb was no longer just a place of burial, it became a symbol of divine permanence, linking heaven and earth in solid, unchanging form. The pyramids that followed grew larger, smoother, and more refined. The builders of the Fourth Dynasty, most famously Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, constructed the Great Pyramids of Giza, which still stand as enduring testaments to Egyptian precision and discipline. The process of construction was long, methodical, and repetitive. It involved the quarrying of limestone blocks, their transportation by sled and barge, and their placement layer upon layer under the hot sun. Thousands of laborers participated, working in organized teams, fed and housed in nearby settlements. Contrary to modern assumptions, it was not slave labor but a system of state service, in which farmers worked on royal projects during the months when the fields were flooded and unworkable. Thus, even the pyramids were built in rhythm with the Nile's eternal cycle. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom were regarded as gods on earth, embodiments of divine order. Their rule was absolute, but it was not arbitrary. Each king was responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the universal balance between life and death, fertility and drought, justice and chaos. Temples were built to honor the gods, but also to ensure the pharaoh's role as mediator between the divine and the earthly realms. Daily rituals were performed by priests who washed, dressed, and offered food to statues of the gods, maintaining their presence in the material world. The temples, like the pyramids, were centers of activity, not of worship by the people but of service to the divine order. It was noted that daily life during the Old Kingdom remained much as it had been for centuries. Farmers continued to sow and harvest, artisans continued to craft pottery and jewelry, and fishermen continued to work the river. Yet, the organization of society became more defined. The hierarchy was clear. At the top stood the pharaoh, followed by nobles, priests, scribes, craftsmen, and farmers. Each group had its duties and privileges. The system worked because it was stable and predictable. Everyone understood their role, and few sought to alter it. The Egyptians found comfort in routine, and through that routine, they achieved endurance. The bureaucracy that sustained this vast kingdom was both detailed and efficient. Taxes were collected in kind, grain, livestock, or labor. Records were meticulously kept by scribes who used hieroglyphs on papyrus scrolls and temple walls. Every shipment of grain, every consignment of stone, and every offering to the gods was recorded. The act of writing itself was considered sacred, a form of preservation that could resist the decay of time. It was believed that words, once inscribed, carried a kind of immortality, just as the pyramids carried the bodies of kings into eternity. The economy of the Old Kingdom was based primarily on agriculture, but it extended to trade with neighboring regions. Expeditions were sent to Sinai for copper and turquoise, to Nubia for gold, and to the Red Sea for incense and rare goods. These journeys were long and carefully planned, supported by detailed logistics. The Egyptian state was self-sufficient in many ways, yet it valued the exchange of materials that enhanced ritual and construction. Trade, like all else in Egyptian life, was conducted according to a deliberate rhythm, governed by the seasons and the river. The Egyptians' understanding of death continued to develop during this era. The belief in an afterlife became more elaborate, and the preparation for it more detailed. The pyramid texts, inscribed within royal tombs, contained spells intended to guide the king's soul through the afterlife. It was believed that death was not an end but a transition, a continuation of life in another form. To ensure this continuity, great care was taken in the burial process. The body was preserved through mummification, wrapped in linen, and placed within nested coffins. Food, furniture, and small statues were buried alongside the deceased to provide comfort and sustenance in eternity. The art of the Old Kingdom reflected these same ideals of stability and order. Statues of kings, nobles, and scribes were carved with calm expressions and symmetrical proportions. Scenes of daily life, fishing, farming, feasting, decorated the walls of tombs. These images were not created for beauty alone but served a practical and spiritual purpose, to ensure that these activities would continue forever in the afterlife. The Egyptian artist did not seek to capture a moment but to preserve a pattern. Every figure, every line, every color followed conventions established generations before. Art was not self-expression but repetition, the visual form of Ma'at. As the centuries passed, the system of the Old Kingdom reached its height. The pyramids of Giza stood complete, the temples at Memphis flourished, and Egypt's administration functioned with quiet precision. Yet beneath this calm surface, strains began to appear. The cost of maintaining such vast projects placed increasing demands on the state. Provincial governors, distant from the royal court, began to exercise more independence. The centralized authority that had sustained Egypt for so long began to loosen, not through rebellion but through the gradual diffusion of power. By the end of the 6th dynasty, around 2200 BCE, the Old Kingdom began to weaken. The Nile's floods became less predictable, resulting in famine. Local leaders gained power as the authority of the pharaoh diminished. It was not a collapse marked by violence, but a slow, natural decline, an ebb in the great rhythm of Egyptian history. The unity that had characterized the kingdom dissolved into regional rule, marking the beginning of what historians now call the First Intermediate Period. Yet even in decline, the legacy of the Old Kingdom endured. The pyramids remained as silent witnesses to a civilization that had built not for the moment but for eternity. The ideals of order, balance, and continuity would persist through every age that followed. Egypt would rise and fall many times, but its essence, the calm, measured rhythm of life along the Nile, would remain unchanged. The Old Kingdom, in its quiet grandeur, had set the pattern for all that would come after. After the long stability of the Old Kingdom, Egypt entered a slower and less certain era known as the First Intermediate Period. This phase, beginning around 2200 BCE, was not marked by sudden collapse or destruction, but rather by a gradual dispersal of power. The strong, centralized authority of the pharaohs weakened, and local rulers, governors, nobles, and officials, began to control their own regions independently. The Nile's floods had become irregular, leading to food shortages and hardship. With fewer resources to distribute, the royal court at Memphis lost its ability to maintain loyalty across the land. Egypt became a collection of semi-autonomous provinces, each maintaining its own affairs. It was observed that even in this fragmented state, Egyptian life did not cease. Farmers continued to plant crops when the river allowed, craftsmen continued to work, and priests continued their rituals in the temples. The rhythm of daily life persisted, though now guided by local authority rather than by the pharaoh's hand. Inscriptions from this period describe both suffering and resilience. There were reports of famine, disorder, and unrest, yet also of rebuilding and adaptation. It was a time of testing, but not of ruin. The Egyptian instinct for continuity remained strong. In many regions, local leaders took on the role of protectors and providers, establishing small centers of stability. The governors of Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt and Thebes in Upper Egypt emerged as the most prominent. Each claimed legitimacy, and each sought to restore unity. Thebes, in particular, would eventually prevail. Its rulers, beginning with Entefi and continuing with Mentuhotep II, managed to reunite the country around 2050 BCE, thus bringing the First Intermediate Period to an end. Mentuhotep II, ruling from Thebes, was regarded as a restorer of order, and with his reign began the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom, spanning roughly from 2050 to 1750 BCE, was characterized by a conscious effort to restore balance and harmony. The pharaohs of this era understood that unity had to be maintained through cooperation as much as through power. The government became more organized, with a renewed focus on administration, justice, and irrigation. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, especially Amenemhat I and Senusret I, re-established centralized authority but allowed provincial leaders to retain limited power under royal supervision. It was an arrangement based on equilibrium, reflecting the Egyptian preference for measured control rather than domination. The capital was moved northward from Thebes to Ichtoi, near modern Fayum. This location, between Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolized balance and centrality. From here, the pharaoh and his officials managed the affairs of the kingdom. The bureaucracy grew more efficient, with scribes maintaining meticulous records of land ownership, harvests, and taxes. The collection of grain was once again standardized, and storage facilities were built to prevent famine. Canals and irrigation channels were repaired and expanded. Through these steady, practical measures, Egypt regained its prosperity. Culturally, the Middle Kingdom represented a return to reflection and modesty. Literature flourished, not as extravagant praise of kings but as quiet meditations on life, order, and morality. Texts such as The Instructions of Amenemhat, The Tale of Sinew, and The Eloquent Peasant reveal a more introspective tone. It was observed that the Egyptians of this era began to consider not only the greatness of the pharaoh but also the place of the individual within society. The ideal of Ma'at remained central, but it was now expressed in terms of personal virtue as well as state order. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom also turned their attention to the borders of Egypt. Fortresses were built in Nubia to the south to secure trade routes and to control the flow of gold, ivory, and other valuable resources. Expeditions were sent into the deserts and beyond the Sinai Peninsula to mine copper and turquoise. These undertakings were methodical and sustained, never reckless. The Egyptians expanded their reach carefully, preferring stability over conquest. In art and architecture, the Middle Kingdom maintained the formal traditions of the past while introducing subtle refinements. Statues from this period display more realism, with pharaohs depicted as thoughtful, even weary, rather than eternally youthful and idealized. This change may reflect a growing awareness of human responsibility in leadership. Temples and tombs were constructed with less grandeur than those of the Old Kingdom, yet with great attention to proportion and symbolism. Rock-cut tombs in Thebes and Beni Hassan reveal scenes of daily life, hunting, fishing, and farming, all rendered with careful repetition and order. Religion during the Middle Kingdom continued to evolve. The cult of Osiris, god of the afterlife, grew increasingly important. It was believed that not only kings but also ordinary people could attain eternal life through proper conduct and ritual preparation. This democratization of the afterlife marked a shift in Egyptian belief. The elaborate rituals of mummification, once reserved for royalty, became more common among the wealthy and middle classes. Coffin texts, containing spells and prayers for guidance in the afterlife, replaced the earlier pyramid texts. These were written in detailed hieroglyphs on the inside of wooden coffins, each line carefully inscribed to preserve the soul's passage. Trade and agriculture continued to sustain Egypt's economy. The land was fertile, the administration efficient, and the people industrious. Farmers worked the fields, tending crops of wheat and barley. Artisans produced fine jewelry, pottery, and furniture. The Nile's rhythm, once disrupted, had returned to predictability. Life, as always, proceeded in cycles: flood, planting, harvest, rest. The pharaohs were seen as guardians of this balance rather than as conquerors or divine beings above it. The Middle Kingdom also saw the construction of remarkable engineering works. The Fayum Basin was developed through an elaborate system of canals to control water flow and expand farmland. This project reflected the Egyptian belief that prosperity came from managing nature in harmony, not by overpowering it. The careful distribution of water mirrored the broader social order, measured, organized, and continuous. By the later years of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt once again enjoyed stability. Literature, art, and trade flourished, and temples were restored across the land. Yet, as before, prosperity carried within it the seeds of decline. Power gradually became concentrated among local administrators, and the central government weakened. External pressures increased as groups from Asia, known as the Hyksos, began to settle in the delta. They brought new technologies, including the horse and chariot, which would later transform Egyptian warfare. As the 13th dynasty gave way to the 14th, the unity of Egypt slowly dissolved. The pharaohs remained in name, but their control waned. The Hyksos established their own rule in the north, while Thebes continued to govern the south. The pattern of division returned, marking the beginning of another intermediate period. Yet, even in this division, the essential rhythm of Egyptian civilization persisted. The temples still received offerings. The scribes still recorded the flow of grain. The people still waited for the rise of the Nile. Thus, the Middle Kingdom came to an end not with violence but with quiet transition, as authority once again shifted and the great cycles of Egyptian history turned anew. Through it all, the Egyptians held fast to their belief in order and continuity. The land, the river, and the sky remained constant. The pharaohs rose and fell, but the calm endurance of the Nile endured, as it always had, and as it always would. When the stability of the Middle Kingdom gradually weakened, Egypt entered another phase of division and transition known as the Second Intermediate Period. This period, beginning around 1750 BCE, was characterized not by chaos but by slow disunity. Power fragmented once again, as foreign settlers, the Hyksos, established control over the delta in the north while native Egyptian rulers continued to govern from Thebes in the south. It was a time when Egypt's borders remained but its unity wavered. Yet even in this divided state, the Egyptians continued to live much as they had always lived, planting, harvesting, recording, and offering prayers to the gods. Life continued, and the Nile still rose. The Hyksos, whose name meant rulers of foreign lands, introduced new elements into Egyptian life. They brought horses, chariots, and improved bronze weaponry, innovations that would later strengthen Egypt itself. Their rule, based in the city of Avaris, lasted for more than a century. It was observed that they adopted many Egyptian customs, worshipped Egyptian gods, and used hieroglyphic writing. Thus, even the so-called foreigners became part of the Egyptian pattern. Meanwhile, the rulers of Thebes quietly rebuilt their strength, first under Seqenenretau and later under Kamose and Ahmose. Their efforts were slow, deliberate, and strategic, culminating in the expulsion of the Hyksos around 1550 BCE. With the reunification of Egypt under Ahmose I, the new kingdom began. This period, lasting from about 1550 to 1070 BCE, marked the height of Egypt's power and prosperity. It was an age of expansion, monumental building, and renewed order. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, Ahmose, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and Amenhotep III, established Egypt as a great power, yet they did so in the measured, organized fashion characteristic of their civilization. The government grew more complex, the temples more elaborate, and the influence of religion more visible in every aspect of life. The New Kingdom pharaohs ruled from Thebes, where grand temples such as Karnak and Luxor rose on the east bank of the Nile. These were not merely places of worship but centers of administration, wealth, and ritual. The temples employed thousands of workers, priests, scribes, artisans, and laborers, all devoted to maintaining the spiritual and practical order of the kingdom. Offerings of food, drink, and incense were made daily. It was believed that through these repeated acts, the gods were sustained and harmony was preserved. The temples thus became the living heart of Egyptian society, pulsing quietly with the rhythm of devotion and duty. Hatshepsut, one of the most remarkable rulers of this period, reigned as pharaoh in her own right. She undertook great building projects, most notably her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, with its terraces and colonnades blending into the cliffs of western Thebes. Her reign was characterized not by conquest but by trade and stability. Expeditions were sent to Punt, bringing back incense, gold, and exotic goods. The peace she maintained allowed for prosperity, and her rule exemplified the calm and steady governance that Egyptians valued. After her reign, Thutmose III expanded Egypt's influence through campaigns in Syria and Nubia, creating an empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the Fourth Cataract. These military activities were methodical and well recorded, emphasizing precision rather than aggression. The new kingdom also saw the refinement of art and architecture. Temples were decorated with reliefs showing the pharaoh making offerings to the gods, scenes repeated endlessly from one reign to the next. The proportions were standardized, the gestures familiar, the colors symbolic. Even as Egypt's empire expanded, its artistic expression remained rooted in order and continuity. Tombs in the Valley of the Kings were carved deep into rock, their walls covered with detailed scenes from the Book of the Dead, intended to guide the deceased through the afterlife. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom no longer built pyramids, but their tombs carried the same purpose, to preserve the body, sustain the soul, and ensure eternal stability. Religion reached its greatest complexity in this era. The sun god Ammonius Ra became the central deity, merging the local god Ammonius of Thebes with Ra, the ancient sun god of Heliopolis. The cult of Ammonius grew powerful, supported by vast temple estates and wealth. It was believed that the pharaoh ruled by the will of Ammonius, and his victories were seen as divine blessings. Temples became not only spiritual centers but also economic institutions, owning land, livestock, and workshops. Priests administered these resources with the same meticulous care as royal officials managed the state. During the reign of Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, a brief experiment in religious reform took place. Akhenaten attempted to replace the traditional gods with the worship of a single deity, Aten, represented as the sun disk. He moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, and ordered temples to be dedicated solely to Aten. Art during this period became more naturalistic, showing the royal family in intimate domestic scenes. However, this change was not long-lasting. After Akhenaten's death, his reforms were reversed, his city abandoned, and traditional worship restored under the young pharaoh Tutankhamun. The Egyptians, it seemed, preferred the old order, the familiar pattern of many gods, many rituals, and a balance of divine forces. The later pharaohs of the 19th and 20th dynasties, such as Seti I and Ramesses II, continued the work of consolidation. Ramesses II, often called Ramesses the Great, built extensively, leaving temples and monuments across Egypt. His most famous structure, the temple at Abu Simbel, was carved into the cliffs of Nubia, its colossal statues facing the rising sun. The temple's alignment with the solar cycle reflected the precision and continuity of Egyptian architecture. Even in grandeur, the emphasis remained on order and symmetry. Egypt's influence during the New Kingdom extended far beyond its borders. Trade routes connected it to the Mediterranean, the Near East, and Africa. Foreign goods, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, incense from Punt, flowed into the kingdom. Diplomacy flourished, with treaties and exchanges between Egypt and other powers such as the Hittites and Babylonians. The world beyond Egypt was acknowledged, yet Egypt remained self-contained, confident in its enduring traditions. As the new kingdom reached its height, the burden of maintaining empire grew heavy. Military campaigns, temple endowments, and court luxuries required vast resources. Over time, the power of the priesthood, particularly of Ammonius, began to rival that of the pharaohs. The central government, though still functioning, became strained. The great monuments continued to rise, but they were increasingly built as echoes of earlier grandeur rather than as expressions of new vitality. By the end of the 20th dynasty, around 1070 BCE, Egypt entered another period of division. The new kingdom had lasted nearly 5 centuries, a long age of achievement, order, and repetition. It ended not in collapse but in slow dispersal, as Thebes and the Delta again drifted apart in authority. The temples still stood, the rituals still continued, but the unified voice of Egypt grew quieter. And yet, through every shift and every dynasty, the essence of Egypt endured. The Nile continued its ancient rhythm. The people continued their work, their prayers, and their belief in balance. The new kingdom, like the river itself, had flowed from rise to fullness to decline, and in that rhythm. After the long grandeur of the new kingdom came a quieter and more fragmented age. Egypt entered what historians call the Third Intermediate Period, beginning around 1070 BCE. This era did not open with destruction or collapse but with gradual separation. The pharaohs still ruled in name, but their power became divided. In the north, at Tanis, kings of the 21st dynasty governed the Delta. In the south, at Thebes, the high priests of Ammonius controlled the temples and the wealth of the old religious estates. Egypt was still one land, yet it was ruled by 2 centers of authority, both acknowledging each other while quietly acting apart. It was observed that even in division, Egypt's way of life continued with calm persistence. The temples of Ammonius at Thebes remained active. Daily offerings continued, scribes kept records, and workers maintained canals and tombs. The ordinary rhythm of Egyptian existence, planting, harvest, worship, was never interrupted for long. The government's power may have weakened, but society itself endured, sustained by habit and faith. The kings of Tanis sought legitimacy by linking themselves with the memory of the great pharaohs of the past. They restored monuments, inscribed their names beside those of earlier rulers, and performed the ancient rituals of kingship. Meanwhile, the priests of Ammonius in Thebes ruled with quiet authority, managing temple lands that stretched across Upper Egypt. This system of shared control, though delicate, maintained peace for nearly 2 centuries. The bureaucracy functioned as before, and the Nile continued its steady course. Eventually, new dynasties arose from outside influences. Around 945 BCE, Libyan chieftains, who had long settled in the Delta, established the 22nd dynasty under Shoshenq. These Libyan rulers adopted Egyptian customs and titles, blending foreign leadership with Egyptian tradition. Their rule extended over much of the land, though local governors retained a measure of independence. The Libyans maintained the temples, observed the old festivals, and upheld Ma'at, the principle of balance and order that had defined Egypt for millennia. Yet, as time passed, Egypt's unity again fragmented. By the 8th century BCE, local dynasties in both the north and south ruled semi-independently. It was a patchwork of small kingdoms, each following the old forms, each claiming divine favor. The names of these rulers are now little remembered, but their actions were guided by the same sense of continuity that had always defined the Egyptian way. Even in political weakness, the structure of life remained unchanged. a new power eventually appeared from the south. The Kingdom of Kush, based in Nubia, had long been influenced by Egyptian culture. Around 750 BCE, the Kushite king Pi marched north and unified Egypt once more under his rule. He respected Egyptian religion, restored temples, and presented himself as the protector of ancient traditions. His successors, known as the 25th dynasty, ruled Egypt from both Napata in Nubia and Thebes in Upper Egypt. Their reign was marked by careful imitation of Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom models. It was as though the Egyptians, under foreign rulers, returned to the earliest expressions of their civilization to regain balance. The Kushite pharaohs, such as Pi, Shabaka, and Taharka, undertook extensive temple restorations and construction projects. They revived the worship of Ammonius and renewed the old rituals that had sustained Egypt for centuries. The blending of Nubian and Egyptian traditions created a brief but peaceful revival of cultural strength. Yet, to the north, new powers were rising. The Assyrians of Mesopotamia expanded westward, bringing with them the inevitability of change. It was in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that the earliest permanent settlements began to appear. These settlements did not emerge suddenly but developed gradually over many generations as people shifted from temporary camps to more stable dwellings. The reason for this shift was simple and practical. The rivers provided steady water, the land was fertile, and the conditions allowed crops to be grown year after year in the same places. It was found that staying near the rivers made life easier, though it also demanded constant maintenance of canals and fields. Villages formed wherever the soil was rich enough and the distance to water was manageable. The earliest known settlements were small, usually consisting of a few families living close together. Archaeological remains suggest that these communities were built using the most available and simplest material, mud. The land of Mesopotamia had little stone and even less wood, but there was an endless supply of river mud, which when mixed with straw could be shaped into bricks. These mud bricks were left to dry in the sun and used for building walls and foundations. The process was repetitive and unchanging. Mud was dug from riverbanks, mixed, pressed into molds, dried, and stacked. This same process was repeated for centuries with little variation. The texture of the bricks, the way they were arranged, and the patterns of walls became characteristic of Mesopotamian construction. Around 670 BCE, the Assyrian armies invaded Egypt, defeating the Kushite rulers and installing their own governors. For a short time, Egypt became part of the Assyrian Empire, though local rulers continued to govern in the name of Egyptian kingship. After the Assyrians withdrew, native Egyptian leaders reasserted control under Psamtik I of the 26th dynasty, based in Sais. This period, known as the Late Period, was one of restoration and deliberate revival. The rulers of Sais sought to return Egypt to its former greatness by emphasizing the stability of the past. The Sate kings repaired temples, encouraged art in classical forms, and reorganized the administration. Scribes once again copied texts from earlier ages, ensuring that the knowledge of the past was preserved. The art of the Late Period is notable for its precision and careful imitation of Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom styles. Statues and reliefs were carved with deliberate restraint, avoiding innovation. It was a conscious return to tradition, a quiet reaffirmation of what Egypt had always been. Trade and foreign contact expanded during this era. Greek merchants established colonies at Naucratis in the Delta, bringing goods and ideas from across the Mediterranean. The Egyptians welcomed trade but maintained their distinct identity. Their art, language, and rituals continued unchanged, repeating forms that were already 2,000 years old. It was as though Egypt, in the face of foreign influence, chose not to adapt but to remember. Religion in the late period remained deeply entrenched in tradition. The temples of Ammonius, Ra, Ta, and Osiris continued to function with the same rituals that had been performed for centuries. The priests remained influential, overseeing vast temple estates and maintaining the ancient ceremonies. The practice of mummification became even more elaborate, extending to sacred animals such as cats, ibises, and crocodiles. It was believed that preserving these creatures honored the gods they represented. The people of Egypt still looked to the pharaoh as a symbol of order, though his power was now limited. The land had become accustomed to cycles of unity and division, strength and weakness. Yet through every change, the fundamental pattern of Egyptian life endured. The fields were sown, the river flooded, the temples echoed with prayers, and the sun rose and set across the desert horizon, as it had since the first dynasties. Foreign rule, however, became increasingly common. After the Persians conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, the country became part of the Achaemenid Empire. The Persians ruled with tolerance, allowing Egyptian religion to continue. They appointed satraps to administer the land but respected local customs. It was observed that Egyptian scribes continued to record harvests and rituals with the same precision as before. Even under Persian kings, the rhythm of Egyptian life did not break. A brief period of independence returned under native rulers in the 4th century BCE, but it was short-lived. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Egypt, greeted not as a conqueror but as a liberator. The Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, accepted him as pharaoh. In Alexandria, his successors, the Ptolemies, established a new dynasty that blended Greek and Egyptian traditions. The temples of the old gods continued to function alongside the new culture of Hellenistic learning. It was, as always, an adaptation without abandonment, a continuation of form beneath the appearance of change. Thus, through the Third Intermediate and late periods, Egypt persisted as a civilization of endurance. Foreign rulers came and went, yet the Egyptians maintained their ancient customs. The same prayers were spoken, the same symbols carved, the same river followed its eternal course. The power of kings faded, but the quiet order of daily life remained. The story of Egypt was never one of conquest or collapse. It was the story of survival through repetition, of faith sustained through centuries, of a civilization that found permanence not in empire but in rhythm. When Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BCE, the transition was calm, almost ceremonial. The Persians had ruled the land before him, but their authority had been distant and impersonal. Alexander, however, was received as a liberator. He respected Egyptian traditions, offered sacrifices to the ancient gods, and was proclaimed pharaoh by the priests of Memphis. It was observed that his acceptance by the Egyptians was not due to conquest but to continuity. He did not alter their customs or suppress their beliefs, he simply inserted himself into the long, unbroken line of kingship that had begun thousands of years earlier. Shortly after his arrival, Alexander ordered the construction of a new city near the Mediterranean coast. This city, called Alexandria, was designed as a port of trade, culture, and learning. It was laid out on a grid, with wide streets and a harbor that opened onto the sea. The city grew rapidly, becoming a bridge between Greek and Egyptian worlds. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his generals, and Egypt came under the rule of Ptolemy I Soter, the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, from 305 to 30 BCE. They were Macedonian Greeks by origin, but they adopted Egyptian titles, rituals, and iconography. Each Ptolemaic ruler was depicted on temple walls wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, performing offerings to the gods just as the pharaohs had done for millennia. It was observed that the Ptolemies governed with two faces, Greek in administration, Egyptian in symbolism. Greek was the language of the court and the bureaucracy, while Egyptian remained the language of the temples and the people. The capital, Alexandria, became one of the most prominent cities of the ancient world. It was home to the famous Library of Alexandria, where scholars collected and studied texts from across the Mediterranean and Near East. The city's lighthouse, the Pharos, was one of the 7 wonders of the world, a towering structure that guided ships safely into harbor. The museum, or Mouseion, functioned as a research institution, where mathematicians, astronomers, and physicians worked in quiet study. The intellectual atmosphere was deliberate and contemplative, reflecting the same ordered curiosity that had long characterized Egyptian thought. Despite its Greek administration, traditional Egyptian religion flourished. The Ptolemies supported the temples, restored ancient sanctuaries, and introduced new hybrid forms of worship. One of the most significant was the cult of Serapis, a deity combining elements of the Egyptian Osiris and the Greek Zeus. This fusion allowed Greeks and Egyptians to share common religious ground while preserving their distinct identities. Temples such as those at Edfu, Dendera, and Philae were built or renovated during this era. Their walls, covered with hieroglyphs, continued to record rituals that had remained unchanged since the days of the Old Kingdom. Economically, the Ptolemaic period was prosperous. Agriculture remained the foundation of the economy, supported by the annual flooding of the Nile. The state controlled the production and distribution of grain, ensuring stability and revenue. Trade expanded beyond Egypt's borders, connecting the country to the Mediterranean world, Africa, and the Indian Ocean. Greek settlers introduced new crops and techniques, but the fundamental rhythm of Egyptian farming, plowing, sowing, and harvesting according to the river's cycles, remained constant. The society of Ptolemaic Egypt was diverse. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and others lived side by side, each community following its own customs. The Greeks held most administrative positions, but Egyptians continued to manage temples, crafts, and agriculture. The coexistence was structured and functional rather than equal. Hieroglyphic writing persisted for religious inscriptions, while Greek dominated government documents. Yet both systems reflected the same devotion to order and record-keeping that had always defined Egyptian civilization. Over time, the Ptolemaic rulers became increasingly dependent on alliances and diplomacy. Internal conflicts among royal family members were frequent but formal, lacking the chaos often associated with such disputes elsewhere. The most famous of these rulers was Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemies. Educated, multilingual, and deeply aware of Egypt's traditions, Cleopatra sought to preserve her kingdom's independence amid the growing power of Rome. Her reign was marked by careful negotiation, first with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony. Under Cleopatra, Egypt remained outwardly stable. The temples continued their rituals, the Nile continued to flood, and the daily lives of the people proceeded as they always had. Yet, the influence of Rome increased steadily. When Cleopatra and Mark Antony were defeated by Octavian, later Augustus, at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Egypt became a Roman province. With this event, more than 3,000 years of native kingship came to a quiet end. The Roman period, beginning in 30 BCE, changed Egypt's political structure but not its essential character. The emperors of Rome became pharaohs in title, and their images appeared in temples performing the ancient offerings. The rituals continued, the priests officiated, and the hieroglyphic text still flowed across the walls of stone. The administration became more efficient and taxation more systematic, yet the daily life of most Egyptians remained tied to the land and the river. The grain of Egypt became vital to Rome, feeding its population and its legions. Ships loaded with wheat sailed regularly from Alexandria to the harbors of the Mediterranean. Under Roman rule, Alexandria retained its prominence as a center of learning and commerce. Scholars continued to study at the library, though the original institution likely suffered from neglect and eventual loss. The city's population grew, its streets filled with merchants, sailors, and philosophers. Greek, Latin, and Egyptian languages mingled, yet the rhythms of Egyptian life, its festivals, its agricultural cycles, its devotion to the gods, remained largely unchanged in the countryside. Temples continued to be built during the Roman period, including the beautiful Temple of Isis at Philae, which remained active until the 6th century CE. The worship of the old gods persisted alongside the gradual introduction of new beliefs. Christianity began to spread through Egypt in the 1st century CE, bringing with it new forms of thought and organization. Yet even the early Christian communities retained echoes of Egyptian tradition, preserving the value of silence, ritual, and endurance. By the time of the late Roman Empire, the use of hieroglyphic writing had faded. The last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to 394 CE, carved on the temple at Philae. The language that had recorded Egypt's history for thousands of years was no longer understood. Still, the temples and monuments stood quietly, enduring the passage of time. The sand covered many, the river changed course, yet the forms remained, silent, patient, and unchanged. Thus, the Ptolemaic and Roman periods marked not the end of Egypt but the continuation of its deepest essence. The rulers changed, the gods were renamed, the languages shifted, but the pattern of life persisted. The Nile still rose and receded, the people still worked and prayed, and the stone temples still faced the sun. Egypt, through all its transformations, remained what it had always been, a civilization of calm endurance, defined not by conquest but by the quiet strength of repetition and time. In the long and measured unfolding of Egyptian history, what is most striking is not its moments of conquest or change, but its remarkable continuity. Across more than 3 millennia, Egypt remained steady in its essence, an organized society built along a single river, bound by the same cycles of water, soil, and sun. The forms of its life, its temples, its tombs, its rituals, changed in appearance but not in spirit. Each generation repeated the work of the last, tending the fields, honoring the gods, recording the seasons, and preserving the order known as Ma'at. It was through this repetition that Egypt endured. From the earliest farmers who settled on the riverbanks to the pharaohs who built pyramids, from the priests of Thebes to the scholars of Alexandria, all were connected by the same quiet rhythm of existence. The Nile was the constant thread, its floods marking the passage of time more reliably than any calendar. Its rise and retreat governed agriculture, religion, and the sense of life itself. The Egyptians learned early that survival depended not on mastery of nature but on harmony with it. That understanding shaped their art, their architecture, and their faith. The monuments of Egypt, its pyramids, temples, and colossal statues, were not built to impress but to preserve. Each stone was placed with deliberate care, meant to resist decay and carry memory across centuries. The same spirit that guided the building of the Great Pyramid also guided the scribe copying a hymn, the farmer tending his field, and the artisan carving a small amulet. All were acts of stability, each one part of a greater rhythm. Foreign rulers came and went, Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Yet through each transition, Egypt remained recognizably itself. The pharaoh's title might pass to a foreign king, the language of government might change, but the rituals continued, the temples stood, and the Nile flowed. It was as though Egypt absorbed the world around it without losing its shape, allowing others to rule its surface while it kept its soul intact beneath the sand and stone. Even in decline, the Egyptian people preserved their quiet strength. The end of dynastic rule did not mark the end of their civilization, for its habits and beliefs continued to echo through later ages. The reverence for the sun, the symbolism of rebirth, the idea of the soul's journey, all these found new forms in later religions and philosophies. Egypt's endurance was not only physical but spiritual, it persisted as a memory of order in a world of change. And so, when one looks across the long timeline of Egyptian history, what appears is not a story of rise and fall, but of balance and return. Time in Egypt did not advance, it circled. The same acts were performed, the same words spoken, the same offerings given, year after year, age after age. This repetition, rather than monotony, was a form of peace. Now, as the story of Egypt gently comes to rest, it is easy to imagine the sound of the river flowing quietly through the night, the wind moving softly across the desert, and the ancient stones standing silent beneath the stars. The civilization has long faded, yet its calm still lingers, unchanged, eternal, and at peace. You may now rest, as Egypt has rested, in the slow and endless rhythm of time.